Hey, Shepherd family, this is Pastor Scott Seidler with another installment of our Shepherd podcast, an opportunity to interface with Christians who themselves face the world and bring the compassion of Jesus Christ, the hope of the resurrection, to some of the most pressurized environments a human being can face. Today, I'm joined by Mr. Daniel Speckhard. Daniel is the president and CEO of Chorus International, the parent of international humanitarian organizations like Lutheran World Relief and IMA World Health. He has previously served in the State Department, serving Republican and Democratic administrations as an ambassador and a senior official at NATO. Many of you will be familiar with Lutheran World Relief, which operates in East and West Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East, helping some of the world's poorest communities build the resilience that they need in order to thrive. Daniel, welcome. Hey, what's shaking out in Baltimore these days for you?
Well, I think it's like for everyone. Everybody's burrowed in with the coronavirus, but still doing the work that needs to be done around the world. And I think as you and I talked a little bit before we came on the air, this is a time for innovation. You know, when you're faced with really big challenges, that's the time when you learn the fastest. That's the time when you innovate the fastest. And that's when hopefully we actually progress.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of innovation going on in nonprofits. But even as you say that, I'm always mindful that regardless of these new circumstances that we are experiencing, particularly here in America, there are still people throughout the world who are trying to figure out how to get clean water, how to put food on their table. Talk a little bit about Lutheran World Relief and the mission of that organization and your leadership there.
Well, thanks, Pastor Scott. You're right. I mean, we often forget that this world is filled with 7 billion people, and most of us are living a very privileged life. If you don't have to worry where your next meal is coming from, if you have shelter over your head, and if you have a warm place to get through a winter or water coming into your house. The reality is still 800 million people in this world are living in extreme poverty, and many of those malnourished and hungry. And as you mentioned, water really is not surprising, comes up in the Bible a lot, references to water. But if you travel to many of the developing countries, what you see is just an army of people carrying containers on long marches to go find the water they need just to get through the day. That's repeated every day. Yeah. And the hardships they endure make our lives pale in comparison. And so for me, that's partly what the mission of Lutheran World Relief is, to how to address these overwhelming challenges for many of these communities and families, to just help them give a little bit of an edge, to help them come together as communities, to find solutions that are going to work for them in their culturally context situation, and then give them a chance in the hope that God wants for all of us to be able to provide for our families, to live healthy and productive lives. That's God's vision for our world. And, you know, that's where I think Jesus's focus was. It wasn't on institutions, it was on people.
Yep. Empowering. Go ahead.
I would just tell you a couple examples of seeing that in place that get me excited, Scott, I remember one of my first trips was to Bihar, India. And Bihar is one of the poorest places on earth. There's about 100 million people just in that one place inside of India, in that state inside of India. About half the people are malnourished. 20% of the kids are severely malnourished and stunted. And we had a project there to work with the Dalits. The Dalits, some of you may recall the term untouchables in terms of where they fall on the caste system inside India. So they've been cast aside in that system and left for the most part on their own. And so we were working with the women, and women are the lowest of the low in the context of these caste societies in terms of getting resources and support. And we worked together with these women groups to help them grow vegetable gardens, because until that time, they would usually only grow just one crop. They'd sell it and then feed their family with that one crop, say it was a maize or something like that. And of course, it created malnourishment. They all were producing the same crop at the same time. It was going into a market and the prices were low, and they couldn't really survive. So by growing vegetables, selling them in the local markets, they started to create income for themselves. They created a little self-help group amongst the women where they would save up their money and make loans to each other to help them purchase little things they needed to get them to the next level. And it was amazing to see not just what it did for their survival, for the nutrition of their families, but for their own self-worth, that they too were loved by God in a way, and they too could support and prosper in a way that God wanted them to. That being said, they were still very poor even after we did this. So the message I wanted to share with you was, I asked these women, I was so excited with what they had been able to achieve. And so I asked them, what more can we do for you? You know, what's next on how we can help your development? And they talked amongst themselves. And this head woman came back to me and said, could you help the village next door like you helped us? And I have to say, Scott, that just put my hair on edge and reminded me that I'm still the one learning, not them. That if I, you know, how many times here in the United States or in many of our other big cities that you're broadcasting to around the world, if somebody came and said, what more can I do to help you? Would you not come up with a project that would help your family, your community, your local folks? And to say, can you help the one next door? That is the message that Jesus is constantly saying to us. Right. Think about your neighbor. And so I just wanted to share that little anecdote about the value that I get every day working here, that I get as much out of this as the people we serve.
That's awesome. You know, we hear the phrase toxic charity, and the paternalistic way that in so many instances, aid organizations have come in and solved the problem for a community, as opposed to empowering them and inviting them to actively get involved with the work, so that that sense of self-fulfillment and self-industry is active there. And the addition in your story about how when that happened for this one community, and they want to trust another community with whom they interact with you as a leader and input for them, that's really a pretty special story. Talk about the innovative side, though, because we are living in unique times. We have a worldwide pandemic, and this world is changing. We are becoming more and more interconnected in a global way. How have you and your leadership at Lutheran Word Relief with Chorus International, how are you innovating right now?
Well, for us, what we're thinking about is, what does it really take to have a lasting result? And I know most of your listeners are really captured by that as too. If you want to see what you do in the world last. So, and it's the famous teach to fish rather than give a fish. So we all say this, but the reality is most people would rather give a fish. Somehow it feels better, you know, just a handout or something like that. But that really is useful only in cases of crises and humanitarian disasters. In development, you really do need to focus on partnering in capacity building. One, and two, you need to think more holistically about what the problems somebody faces are, whether it's here actually in the United States in poverty issues or whether it's somewhere else. The challenge is, if you only address one issue of somebody in poverty has, you're probably not going to solve the problem. We'll support you on this. We'll pay your utility bill. Well, we won't help you get an education, so you'll never get a job. So how is that going to help? And same dynamic goes on in the developing world. So as we have taken a much more individual and family-centric approach, start there rather than start where we are and what we want to do. Start with what do they need. We started thinking about, we need more skills and more capabilities and a more holistic approach. So that's where Lutheran World Relief came together, and we partnered with IMA World Health, because we realized we were doing rural development, poverty alleviation, but if mom or dad got sick, the family wasn't going to survive that economically, and whatever good we had done, we would fall back.
Wow.
And more recently, we acquired a technology company that is helping education systems in places like South Sudan and Somalia. How do you help support schools in a place where it's really remote and difficult to get? How do you use technology to take a mobile phone to find out who's in school that day, the teacher, and then give little stipends to the local school boards through cash transfers on the same mobile phones to the school boards to get them to do things in difficult places?
Wow.
This is the kind of way we have to be thinking. And what we were talking about earlier, it's the same kind of innovation that's going on here in the midst of the United States and coronavirus. We have got to move away from just the traditional parts. So we're making these broader partnerships to take a more holistic approach to make sure that when you're going into a community, you're thinking about all of their problems and not just one.
Yeah. As I was introducing you and reading through all the places where Chorus is active, Asia, Middle East, Africa, South America, how do you keep it all straight? I mean, the complexity and the amount of the number of communities that you are working in. How do you just organize, just from a leadership point of view, for those who are listening and who might be leaders of organizations? How do you keep it all straight?
Yeah, and I think, this is always challenging for leaders as to try to figure out how to organize yourself best in terms of, and it's particularly in the international world, there's always this challenge between organizing yourself geographically versus functionally. You have some missions that you do, and you need the technical excellence and specialties in those areas, such as health, rural development, enterprise development, financing, and so forth. But you also need that contextual part that understands the local environments. So for us, I think the first piece is the geographic organization, because the reality is understanding the cultural context and the local situation you operate in is first and foremost. An idea that works well in Mali may not work at all in Honduras. And so what you do want to know is which of those will capture, learn from each other. And so what we have is, a geographic distribution of our structure along the lines of regions and country directors. But then we also have some functional structures that deal with this technology I'm talking, or impact investing, where you can focus on how you're going to invest in business with the experts on actually understanding, knowing how to develop businesses in these local communities. And then you can apply those people to each one of these particular country situations.
No. Did you, in your prior work before getting into non-governmental organizations, did you learn some of this in the State Department? Answer, yes. How does the work in the State Department differ from what you're doing now? I mean, just talk about that learning curve from government to non-government, charitable to, I can get money through taxes. How does that trajectory look? How did that feel? What were some learning points along the way?
Well, I think, it was a humbling experience, because I spent my time in government on a lot of big strategic issues that I would have to say we haven't really been successful at. Early in my career, I worked on the transformation of the former Soviet states, the end of the Cold War, and the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and the hope that there would be transitions to democracy and market economies in Russia and the former Soviet Union. Spent a lot of time on there, and you see what's happening in Russia right now. Spent time 2 years in Iraq trying to help in that transition there as well, and at NATO also thinking about a Europe that's whole and free. A lot of these really hopeful things I worked on, and then you look at the world today and you see a very broken world, national populism, a return to authoritarian regimes, and a fractionalization that's creating this global great powers competition once again in our world. So it's a bit discouraging. But I did take away some things that were pretty helpful for me in the current job. And I'd say 2 or 3. First, you can't impose democracy from the top down, but it is a way to destroy democracy. So the thinking about these things in a much more complex way of what's going on in a country is, you have to start at the grassroots if you want good things to happen. Yep. It's about people. And I think that comes from our faith, Scott, right? I mean, where would Jesus say to start? He'd say, start with the person. He wouldn't say, start by creating a beautiful church and then we'll bring the people later.
Mm.
That's not where his attention was. And so for me, that's one thing I learned, because, in government service, it was always about setting up a new parliament, setting up all these accoutrements of great democratic systems and stuff. And the grassroots was left down the road. Not that we weren't working on it, but it wasn't where the senior attention was. And I learned now that it really starts from the bottom up. Second, I learned that we need to get back to our values, which is when the United States becomes transactional, when they got a bone to pick, when they got something that needs to happen in the world because we feel we've been abused or we've been mistreated, or we got to go fix it because if somebody has threatened us, it ends up creating a bigger mess. When the United States leads by example with values, it changes the world in a powerful, powerful way. And we're always much more successful than when we go to war to teach somebody a lesson in Afghanistan, Iraq, or somewhere else. And I also think that goes back to our faith roots and what we understand with Jesus' teaching for me. So those kind of things for me are kind of the big thing. I think the last thing I would say, and this is a little darker one, is external forces are at play that are really trying to undermine us here in the United States, but not just in the United States, virtually every country out there. Somebody else has an agenda, for your worldwide listeners, and somebody else is trying to interfere in that outcome. For us, I can tell you, having worked on Russia and the former Soviet Union, I am a enlightened person. I want to go the way of light in all of these things, but I also think we have to be honest and truthful with ourselves. Yeah. Their goal is to tear our country apart, to build up division and hatred, and sow misinformation and fear throughout our country, because they think that will be the way to destroy what they see as a threat to them, and show that democracy and the model we have is a failed model. And I think people need to be aware of that. And when they see these things in social media and other things about that create fear in them, to just take a step back. Think about whether that's what God wants you to be thinking about in that fear context, and also understand whether you might be being manipulated, and whether or not a loving, prayerful approach to whatever is being said could get you to a different place.
Yeah. I think just pastorally, so many things have run through my mind in the last 5 minutes. First of all, Jesus' words about people. He looked on the crowds in Matthew chapter 9, I believe it was, and they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd, and his heart went out to them. Not unlike, I think, what our founding fathers felt like back when America and our United States was founded. We were harassed and somewhat helpless. We were not a world power. We were at the whim and will of a British king. And our founding fathers said, this is not right for people to be harassed and helpless like this. We need to enshrine somehow the values of our Christian faith in a constitution that gives value and dignity to every human being. And so when we talk about America being a Christian country, there's a certain truth to that, because no human being created by God in the image of God should ever have to live in fear, harassed, and helpless. And so I'm grateful that not only in our country, but through non-government organizations like Chorus International, Lutheran World Relief, we have advocates that go out into this world and actually attempt to make a difference, not by simply throwing money at the top levels of a state, a civil government, but exactly like you're doing, going in to the very people who themselves are harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd, and being the voice of the good shepherd, being the hands of the good shepherd, helping them learn what it means not only to walk beside still waters, but also to actually have those still waters be drinkable. That's an amazing thing. How did
Pastor Scott? That's powerful words. For me as well, during this time, I just can't help say, we are in the business of social justice and dealing with oppression around the world. This poverty doesn't just happen by accident. This inequity around the world isn't just there by accident. It's because of oppression and inequity in the world. This world has enough food to feed everybody. This world has enough resources to make everybody have a house and to be able to live comfortably and to do it. It's not that simple. It's not just about reallocating it, but there is something in our world that is wrong in the context of how we have organized ourselves in terms of allowing some to oppress others. And it's true almost in every country. And I guess in my mind, Jeremiah 22:3 always comes to the surface, which is where it says, thus says the Lord, do justice and righteousness and deliver from the hand of the oppressor him who was robbed, and do no wrong or violence to the resident alien, the fatherless and the widow, nor shed innocent blood in this place.
Wow.
Since the Old Testament, you don't have to come to the New Testament to get there. Since the Old Testament, this notion of understanding social justice and fairness in our world and recognizing oppression when you see it and caring about it and doing something about it is something that God has been talking to us about for the ages.
I just had a podcast with the former president of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, Jerry Kieschnick, and we were talking about how important it is for every Christian, regardless of whether you're a man or a woman, rich or poor, young or old, it doesn't matter. Everybody has a vocation by which the gospel ministry, the spiritual healing of Jesus Christ can be brought into the world. Daniel, you grew up as the child of a pastor, the son of a pastor, and I bet when you left for college, no one ever thought in the Speckhard family that you were going to be working at the highest levels of world government, and now at the highest levels of bringing healing into various countries and continents of this world. Talk a little bit about how your faith has grown and changed over the years since you were a child in the home of a pastor, and now in many ways, and I say this very intentionally, now you are pastoring through your spiritual and executive leadership transformation across the world.
Well, I'll just say this in more of a personal, maybe, way in terms of responding, Pastor Scott, in that, when you grow up in that environment and your father's a pastor, you see leadership close up. And that's really, on a small boy, something that you really admire in your father and want to emulate. So I think being a son of a pastor is something that helps develop your own leadership skills. But what you're missing, I think, in those early years is it looks like there's the head and then the followers, right? And you aspire to being the leader in the sense you get to be seen and respected and have the prestige, and you get to be the talker, and you get to be up there in the front, and you get to lead in all these different ways. And I guess during my own personal journey, that was enormously powerful in helping my career. It led me to become an ambassador and a leader, and it helped me understand the structural ways that you build confidence and you get people to want to follow and to inspire them and to create vision and strategy in these things. But you get to a point in your career where you realize, wait a second, I'm only half developed here, and I am not fulfilling what God has really called me to be. And that gets back to that notion of what God is talking about when he's talking about a servant leader. It's become a really overused term, but it's starting to hit home for me. And that means that, no, you're not really in charge. You're not really the one calling the shots. You're not really the one that everybody needs to look up to and follow. You're there as the catalyst to really allow people to flourish, to be successful, whether it's in your own organization, whether it's in the communities you're serving, whether it's out there. And it requires a humility that I find to be really hard, because if you've been trained as a leader, you want that humility, but it kind of comes into contradiction with taking charge and running forward and pulling everybody along with you. So I think that's the magic of our faith that God is asking us to find in connection with him. How do you both lead and be very humble and understanding that this isn't your work, this is his work and this is their work, and you really are just there as a facilitator. Hard lesson that I'm trying to learn now as the leader of a nonprofit.
Well, I've always appreciated you, Daniel, getting to know you over these past many years in our larger church network here in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and especially the joy, the humility, the easy conversational way you go about doing your leadership and being a leader out in the larger world. That's been a real joy. We're going to take a quick break, and on the other side of the break, we're going to come back and talk just a little bit more about where we find ourselves in this present moment with COVID-19 ravaging the world. Lutheran World Relief was on the ground in Africa when the Ebola virus occurred. I want to talk and pick Daniel's brain a little bit about what he learned and what we can learn from how Africa has dealt with deadly viruses before, and especially the role that faith-based organizations play in achieving success in the health and well-being of a community that's being afflicted by viruses. We'll see you in just a little bit. Hey, this is Pastor Scott Seidler. Thanks again for joining our Shepherd podcast today, and realize that by doing so, in some ways, you're joining our Shepherd family. You can check out other resources at our church website, shepherdaz.church, and learn how we are reaching out in devotion, in mission, in support for families and neighbors throughout our communities as we lead people to follow Jesus. If you have opportunity to financially support us, you can do that through our website, and I would be very, very grateful for that as we continue to stand up our digital ministry and an outreach beyond our Scottsdale, Phoenix community into our nation, into the world. Thanks again for joining us today. Let's get back to the podcast. As we come back from that little break, I want to just take an opportunity to pick Daniel's brain about what's happening in Africa, particularly around the coronavirus, recognizing that Lutheran World Relief was on the ground and instrumental in how Africans and particular countries dealt with that virus that came before Corona, and that was the deadly Ebola virus. Daniel, talk a little bit about what's going on in Africa with viral stuff and Ebola and coronavirus, and how is Lutheran World Relief and Chorus playing out in that part of the world?
Well, thanks for asking about that. I mean, this is really an important part of our work, is dealing with some of the health crises that overwhelm these communities that are already impoverished, whose health systems are already at the stretching point. And this is an area where we as a developed country can really do a lot to help. They need capacity building, they need support, they need resources, and they need us to be seen as being side by side with them when they deal with it. So if you think it's a challenge here in the United States or in some of the developing countries that may be listening to this, try going to a health clinic in Beni, in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and see what they have. And so that being said, you can have enormous impact on the health of these communities. There are just some basic things that if you can do right, can save literally thousands, if not millions of lives. And so for us, the work we do there is critical. I have to tell you, these people on the front lines of this work are so inspiring. I think of one of ours, Dr. Bill Clemmer. Maybe Google Dr. Bill Clemmer, who every day goes into the Ebola hot zone and works side by side with doctors and nurses to support and promote healing and well-being. And that's in a very insecure environment where these health clinics will get shot up by militants and rogue groups and other things. So in addition to being exposed to the virus, you're exposed to insecurity. These are the kind of people that put themselves at risk. A couple of things that we learned from Ebola that I think are useful for the coronavirus are kind of four I can think of right now. One is start by protecting your healthcare workers. If you're not protecting them, the system will fall down. And I think we know that about here in the United States as well. And when you look at the number of healthcare workers that are dying as a result of this, and what they're going through, the more we can do to protect them, make sure they have the resources and support they need, and honor them in those systems, the better. Secondly, it also won't surprise you, you have to aggressively push back at misinformation and rumor. You've seen that here in the United States. You can't get a straight guidance on just about anything with multiple voices coming every different way. Well, in some of these places in Africa, the rumor will be that, it's the healthcare workers that are injecting this into the people and trying to make them sick because the foreigners, the UN or somebody else is trying to eliminate them. I mean, these are crazy rumors and stories, but they start to pick up because people under stress and in states of fear look to anything. And that's what we have to understand about this. And so fact-based, scientific, supported communications is really important. And we can do a lot at Lutheran World Relief and IMA World Health to help get that out there. Mm-hmm. Third is to engage the local community. You can't succeed at this stuff again. That's not surprising. We talked about it earlier. You can try to do this all from the top, but it's also got to be done at the local level. And getting them to be involved, getting the trusted members of the community to be on board with what has to happen, because this is about social and physical distancing. This is about following rules like washing your hands and and hygiene can do enormous amounts to save lives. You get those trusted elders and leaders out there to say something that's important. And the last thing, which probably won't surprise you, but would surprise a lot of government people, is faith-based networks are indispensable in many places of the world. The only people that are really still trusted are not government officials. They're not UN officials. They're not even NGOs. They're their local faith leader in these places. So we're working with Christian health associations, which provide about half of the healthcare through their Christian hospitals, Christian health clinics, and other things in many of these countries, as well as other faith-based leaders, to make sure that they understand this, including Muslim faith leaders, Hindu faith leaders, and so forth, because it's really the center of faith is where you're going to find trust and social capital in these places. And to fight these viruses, it's really important.
Well, again, the learning curve in a crisis situation, whether it be Ebola or otherwise that you've described, not only is it steep, but it's intense. And again, let's just talk about worker health for your own workers. How do you make sure that your own workers stay healthy? I think I certainly deal with this as a senior pastor in a church, of making sure my congregational leaders, but especially my staff leaders, are being ministered to. I don't do the best job of it, frankly. At least I don't feel I do. How do you go to bed at night feeling good about what's happening for your frontline workers? How do you minister to them, serve them, support them in these steep and intense times of learning and execution?
Well, Pastor Scott, I think you and I talked about this a little offline as well, in terms of these times of innovation are really critical. And I think that's the same dynamic here. You can look at this one way, which says, oh my goodness, we're all separated, we're not in the office, things are getting difficult, and how are we going to take care of each other? But in fact, if you use this moment as a moment of change and a moment of innovation and a moment of caring, it actually can have the opposite effect. What I've seen is that actually, because of this virus, because of the extraordinary event, we as leaders can inspire people to make sure they're taking care of their people better. You wouldn't have thought to ask them, how's it going? What's happening in your house? Is anybody sick? Are you healthy? Because you're so busy just running through the mission of the day. And what I'm finding is, by demonstrating that as leaders, you're finding that the whole organization is doing that. They are supporting each other in ways that they wouldn't support each other. Yeah. The second thing, though, that is much harder is there is this challenge of, you have to do your mission. And where does your mission fit in compared to the risk, right? And we are in different businesses, but very similar businesses. We have to have healthcare workers out there doing this work. Right. It's risky. Right. If we don't want them to get sick, we should keep them all home, but then we're not ministering. And my suspicion is you have the same thing. You can keep everybody isolated, but there's some people in your ministry that have to put themselves at risk, carefully, cautiously, using all of the guidance about masks and hygiene and distancing and everything else. But you can't shut down, right? God's work is going on here, and we have to figure out that balance. So for us, it's, if you don't need to be together, if you don't need to be in the office to do your ministry, go home, work from home. And we found out that a lot more people can work from home than we thought. We didn't think our finance people could work from home, right? We thought they had to be there because the controls and everything else were there. Well, turns out we can. But you can't do that with the healthcare worker delivering the health in Eastern Congo. And so that's a challenge, finding that balance.
Yeah. Hey, last question, and I'm going to let you go with this. You've added so much to our Shepherd family, both here in Scottsdale and online. I'm grateful for your time and also the insight you bring on a variety of different topics related to social justice, advocacy, but also the mission and work of the Christian church. What can we do for you? What's the most important thing? I know that you need dollars. Dollars are important. We translate those dollars overseas into other communities, a high level of accountability, high level of discipline and focus. But what else can we do for you, Daniel, and for your organization to support your work throughout the world?
Well, I would love more partners. So, I mean, just please follow what we're doing, stay connected with us. I would love donations because every dollar we leverage 10 times over in the work in the world. So thank you for those if you're thinking about that. But to be honest with you, my message to you, Scott, is this is about and your listeners, this is about relationships, right? It's building a network of people who care. And our job is to address this overwhelming poverty and injustice and suffering in the world because God has called us to do that. Right. I don't care whether you do it through me or through somebody else. What I want to do is inspire you to do more of it. We are not doing enough. Yeah. And so if I can inspire you to do that, please go out there, show mercy to your neighbor, show love to your neighbor, look at what you have sitting around that you're sitting on top of and wonder whether God is going to ask you in the parable of the talents, you sat on too much of it. And if you are thinking about that, send some my way, send somebody else's way, or get yourself involved with all those other treasures and talents you have in the personal sense to put yourself to work, showing mercy to your neighbor. So that's what you can do for me. And I would like to give you my last gift, Scott, and that is to share the Bible verse that inspires me. I know you've heard it before, but it's Isaiah 58:10. Pour yourself out for the hungry and satisfy the desires of the afflicted, and your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom shall be as noonday. If there was ever a need for light in the darkness, now is the time. Yeah. And don't miss that message that it's your gloom will be as noonday when you go out and help others. God will bless you. So thank you, Scott, for giving me this opportunity.
Hey, thank you so much. And thanks for sharing some of those stories, because it's through hearing stories from a different context that we then see our context a little bit differently. And we therefore write our stories in the days to come a little bit differently. And that's what I appreciate is, you're doing some pretty exotic stuff worldwide in communities and countries with people groups and languages I will probably never even see this side of heaven. But I know at the same time that whether it is in Africa or here in Scottsdale or wherever else one of our listeners is listening, there is ministry to be done. There is healing to be offered. And each and every one of us can do that. So thanks for your stories. And I hope for our Shepherd family that as you get to do your work, that you're building your own God-inspired stories of healing and hopefulness wherever it is that you're living. Thanks again, Daniel Speckhard. Appreciate having you. On the bottom of the screen is some opportunities through the websites of lwr.org to get connected with Lutheran World Relief and Chorus International, along with our Shepherd family. This is Pastor Scott Seidler. Thanks for joining us for this Shepherd podcast. I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Scott.